Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to tackle those really dense, complex topics, the ones that feel overwhelming, and pull out the essential insights so you can walk away feeling informed.
Yeah, and today we're wrestling with a truly fundamental question.
Right.
It underlies pretty much all human interaction, law, everything. Are right and wrong universal?
Exactly. Are they sort of baked into the fabric of the universe, like facts? Or are they more like, incredibly complex agreements we've made up over time?
We're diving deep into metaethics here. That's the branch of philosophy that doesn't ask what is right or wrong, that's normative ethics, but asks about the status, the foundation, the very scope of moral values themselves.
So our mission today, if you will.
It's to really get into this central meta-ethical puzzle. Are moral facts real? Are they true? Completely independent of our minds and cultures? That's moral realism or objectivism.
Or are they just relative? Do they only make sense from a particular standpoint, a specific culture? That's the anti-realism or relativism side.
Precisely. We're trying to figure out which side of that line our moral lives actually fall on, looking at all the sources we've dug into.
Okay. Let's try to pin this down right away with a simple analogy, something we can kind of hold on to for the next, half hour or so.
Good idea.
We're basically asking, is a moral statement like 5 plus 5 equals 10? Or is it more like saying, ooh, spinach tastes bad?
Right. If a moral truth is like 5 plus 5 equals 10, then it's objective. It's true whether you believe it, whether your whole society believes it, doesn't matter. If I stand up and say 5 plus 5 equals 11, I've made a mistake, a verifiable, rational error.
And that's the moral realist or objectivist view. It's a fact out there.
Exactly. But if morality is like spinach tastes bad, well, that's subjective. Totally subjective.
You're just expressing how you feel, right? Your personal taste.
Yeah, just an internal state. You're liking or disliking. And if, hypothetically, we could flip a switch in your brain tomorrow and make you genuinely love spinach.
Today I have zero reason not to eat it. The truth of spinach is bad and it vanishes because I changed.
Precisely. The truth of this statement depends entirely on the person, maybe the culture, making the claim. That's moral relativism.
So that's the core tension we're exploring. Where does morality fit? Math equation or taste preference?
Okay, let's lay some careful groundwork. Define the two main camps clearly.
Good idea. So one side, moral realism, also called objectivism.
Right. This is the pretty strong claim that moral facts, things like torture is wrong, hold true completely regardless of what humans think or feel or what their cultural practices are.
They exist independently of our minds, like gravity or historical facts.
Exactly like historical facts. Think about, say, who the 13th U.S. president was.
Yeah.
Millard Fillmore. That fact exists independently of whether you or I happen to be thinking about Millard Fillmore right now.
Okay. So if I claim it's wrong to inflict unnecessary pain on an innocent person, the objectivist says that statement is true in the same way it's factually true that, Paris is the capital of France.
Yes. You can be factually wrong about geography, and according to the objectivist, you could be factually wrong about morality. An objectivist believes ideas are true or false, period, regardless of anyone's belief about them.
Got it. And the other side?
That's moral anti-realism. Broadly, it just denies that these mind-independent moral facts exist.
And the most common version of that we talk about is moral relativism.
Exactly. The view that ethical codes, our ideas of right and wrong, are relative to the standpoints, the perspectives of the people or cultures who hold them. Morality is constructed, or it's relative to culture.
Okay, and this is where we need to maybe slow down a bit, because relativism gets used really loosely, doesn't it?
It really does. Our sources there are like 3 distinct levels to this idea. It starts with just an observation about the world.
Right. The first step is just noticing something.
It's called descriptive relativism, or DMR. This is purely an empirical thing. You can check it by looking at history, anthropology.
It just says.
It simply states that, as a matter of fact, moral beliefs and practices do vary wildly. Between cultures, within cultures, across time. It's just an observation.
And we see that everywhere, right? I mean, think about views on, say, how you treat animals or economic fairness, or even something like whether kids should question their elders. Huge differences.
Massive differences. And the descriptive relativist just points and says, look, the variation is undeniable. And it seems, pretty unlikely that all these deep differences are just misunderstandings about non-moral facts.
So this observation, this variety, is kind of the launching pad for the philosophical argument.
Exactly. It leads to the core philosophical claim. Metaethical relativism, or MMR. This is the big one.
This isn't just observing difference, this is making a claim about truth.
Right. MMR is the thesis that the truth or justification of a moral judgment, whether it's actually right or wrong, is relative to the moral standard of some person or group.
And critically.
And crucially, no single standpoint, no moral code is objectively superior to any other. There's no universal benchmark.
Okay, let me pause on that. Because that's where it gets really counterintuitive for a lot of us, I think.
It does.
If my culture believes, say, that honesty is always the best policy, and another culture believes that certain polite fictions are sometimes necessary, the metaethical relativist has to say both beliefs are true.
Yes. True relative to their respective codes. Neither is objectively right or wrong in a universal sense.
So when they disagree, they're both kind of in their own world?
According to MMR, yes. The relativist denies there's any neutral external measuring stick you could use to judge between them. Your strong feeling that honesty is always better, that's just a product of your upbringing, your cultural conditioning, not a glimpse of universal moral reality.
Wow. Okay. And then there's a third type.
Yeah, the final step is normative relativism. This one is prescriptive. It tells you what you ought to do.
Ah, so it moves from describing truth to giving advice.
Exactly. It's the position that because there are no universal moral standards, we therefore ought to tolerate those we disagree with morally.
The classic when in Rome, do as the Romans do, or at least don't judge the Romans.
Pretty much. But that one, normative relativism, is actually really controversial, even among philosophers who lean towards relativism generally.
Why is that? It sounds kind of nice. Tolerant.
Because tolerance itself is a moral value. Saying we ought to be tolerant sounds an awful lot like an absolute moral rule.
Ah, so it's kind of smuggling in a universal value. Tolerance is good. Right after saying there are no universal values.
Exactly. It creates this awkward tension, this potential self-contradiction. We'll definitely circle back to that paradox of tolerance later. It's a major hurdle for this view.
Okay, so if the relativist really leans on that sheer variety of moral codes we see, the objectivist often starts their defense somewhere else entirely. They appeal to, like, our actual experience of morality.
Right. What philosophers sometimes call our moral phenomenology, how it feels.
So the phenomenological test, what does that involve?
It basically asks you to just introspect for a moment. Think about when you're in a deep disagreement with someone about a really serious moral issue. Let's take something divisive, like physician-assisted suicide, or maybe fundamental questions about economic justice.
Okay, I'm thinking about it. It usually feels pretty intense.
Right. Now, does that argument feel like you're arguing about objective facts? Like, say, debating whether climate change is human-caused? Or does it feel more like you're arguing over whether, I don't know, pineapple belongs on pizza?
Huh. Definitely not like the pizza argument. When I argue about pizza toppings, I know deep down it's just taste. There's nothing to resolve beyond preference. If I hate pineapple on pizza and you love it, okay, fine. We're both right about our own taste. No external truth involved.
Exactly. But when people get into serious moral debates, questioning assumptions, laying out reasons, trying to persuade each other, it feels completely different, doesn't it?
Yeah, it feels like we're actually trying to figure something out. Like there is a right answer, even if it's hard to find.
It feels like we're searching for an objective truth. Something that exists apart from just our personal feelings or preferences. We talk about moral reasoning, discovering what's right, not just deciding or liking.
So the objectivist says that feeling, that sense that we're dealing with something factual, is actually strong evidence that we intuitively treat morality as objective.
That's a key part of their argument, yes. The experience itself points towards objectivity.
Okay, that's compelling. But couldn't that feeling just be like a really strong illusion? Maybe we're just so conditioned by our culture to think certain things are objectively wrong that it feels that way, even if it isn't.
That's the classic counter-challenge. How do we know the feeling tracks reality? And that leads us to another test the objectivists use, the counterfactual test, the what-if scenario.
Ah, okay. How does this one work?
The counterfactual test is clever because it tries to break that link between what we believe is true and what is true. It asks, would Omer judgment still hold true even if everyone's beliefs and cultural practices were completely different?
Okay, give me an example.
Let's take something most people today would agree on. Say that blatant systemic racial discrimination is morally wrong.
Okay, yes, wrong.
Now, imagine a hypothetical society X. In society X, Everyone, every single person, every law, every institution firmly believes that racial discrimination isn't just acceptable, it's actually morally required for a stable society.
Yeah.
They all genuinely believe it's the right way to live.
Right, a horrifying thought experiment, but
The,
okay.
the counterfactual question is, in society X, where this belief is universal, is racial discrimination morally okay?
My immediate gut reaction is absolutely not. It's still wrong, even if they all think it's right.
And that's exactly the objectivist point. For the objectivist, the answer must be no. The wrongness of the discrimination exists independently of society X's universal belief. It would be just as wrong there as it is here.
Its moral status isn't like fashion trends, right? Like
Sure.
whether people wore powdered wigs in the 18th century, that just depended on the culture.
Precisely. Its wrongness isn't dependent on cultural practice or popular opinion, like the fashionability of top hats. It's an objective feature of the action itself, according to this view.
And the relativist. What do they have to say about Society X?
Well, the consistent metaethical relativist is sort of forced to say, yes, in society X, racial discrimination is morally permissible relative to their moral code. Because for the relativist, that society's code is the ultimate source of moral truth for them.
Wow. So the objectivist uses this ability we have to imagine a terrible consensus and still judge it as wrong as proof that wrongness must be objective, not just a matter of agreement.
Exactly. It suggests the moral fact exists outside of belief. Furthermore, objectivists often push back against the relativist's main weapon, that huge diversity of moral codes,
Yeah, how do they deal with that?
by arguing that many apparent moral disagreements aren't actually about core moral principles at all. They're really disagreements about non-moral facts.
Okay, this seems really important. Unpack that distinction. We're not disagreeing on the value, but on the facts of the world we apply the value to.
Precisely. It's a distinction that often gets overlooked in casual arguments. Think about a historical practice that seems utterly alien and morally horrifying to us now, like set aside the practice in some cultures of killing the elderly when they became infirm.
Right, that seems like a fundamental clash on the value of human life.
On the surface, yes. But what if we dig into the beliefs underlying that practice? What if that culture shared our core value of, say, ensuring a person's well-being and transition to the next life?
How could killing them achieve that?
Well, what if they had a non-moral, factual belief that, for instance, a person enters the afterlife in the physical state they die in? If you believe that, letting someone linger into extreme frailty condemns them to an eternity of suffering.
Ah, I see. So the action killing the elderly stems not from a different moral value, like old people don't matter, but from a different factual belief about the afterlife.
Exactly. The disagreement isn't over the value, care for the elderly, ensuring a good afterlife, but over the fact, how does the body's state at death affect the soul?
So if you could somehow magically prove to them, with evidence, that their factual belief about the afterlife was wrong,
They would presumably stop the practice immediately, without changing their core moral commitment to caring for their elders.
they value care, just like us, but their understanding of, I guess, metaphysics or biology, the non-moral facts, led to an action we find abhorrent.
Precisely. Objectivists argue that many, perhaps most, cross-cultural moral disagreements work like this. They're factual disagreements dressed up as moral ones.
And that allows the objectivist to explain away a lot of that cultural diversity without giving up the idea of universal moral truths. They just say people are often mistaken about the facts of the world. Okay, but even with that explanation about non-moral facts, the relativist still has a really powerful, almost visceral case, doesn't it? Rooted in just looking at history and the world around us.
Oh, absolutely. The argument from disagreement is still the bedrock, the empirical foundation of relativism.
It just keeps coming back to the sheer, stubborn reality of moral conflict.
Yeah, think back to Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian. He wrote about the just mutual horror between the Greeks and a tribe in India called the Galatians.
What was the issue?
Funeral practices. The Greeks cremated their dead fathers. The Galatians ate their dead fathers. Herodotus noted that neither group could be persuaded, even with vast sums of money, to adopt the other's custom. Each found the other's practice fundamentally repulsive and wrong.
And that kind of deep, irreconcilable difference seems common throughout history.
It does. And the relativist draws a sharp contrast here with fields we generally agree are objective, like science or math.
Right. When scientists disagree, say, about the interpretation of an experiment, what usually happens?
Well, usually it's down to things like inadequate data, flawed instruments, maybe misinterpretation. But the key is, over time, scientific disagreement tends towards convergence. Errors get found, theories get refined, experiments get replicated, and we generally move towards a consensus based on evidence.
We figure out the right answer, eventually.
More or less, yes. But moral conflicts. They often show no sign of that kind of rational convergence. The relativist argues that big moral shifts aren't typically settled by someone discovering the objective moral truth,
How are they settled, then?
often by power, by politics, by force, by economic changes. Think of the abolition of slavery in the West. Relativists point out it happened to coincide pretty neatly with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, which made wage labor economically preferable to slavery in many contexts.
So the argument is that the moral progress was driven more by economic convenience than by some sudden discovery that slavery was objectively wrong.
That's the cynical but perhaps realistic interpretation the relativist puts forward. If morality was objective like, say, chemistry, why haven't we figured it out by now? Why, after millennia of human thought, haven't we settled on the single true moral system?
That's a tough question. It leads right into the problem of the single true morality.
Exactly. Relativists look at philosophy itself and ask, if objective moral truth exists, why can't even the supposed experts, the objectivist philosophers, agree on what it is?
You've got totally different systems. Kant focused on duty and rules.
Deontology, yes. Then you have Mill focusing on consequences and happiness.
Utilitarianism.
Okay.
And they often give completely different answers to moral dilemmas.
And the debate between them is ancient and shows no sign of ending. If moral reality is out there, objective and real, why are our maps of it so wildly contradictory and contested? The relativist concludes, well, maybe there is no objective map to be drawn. Morality is just a product of time and place.
This kind of deep skepticism about finding objective moral truth often pushes people towards an even more radical view, right? Something called non-cognitivism.
Yes. This is where you stop treating moral statements as claims about facts at all.
So when I say charity is good or stealing is wrong, I'm not actually stating something that could be true or false.
According to non-cognitivism, no. You're doing something else entirely. You're fundamentally expressing an emotional attitude or maybe issuing a command.
Like cheering or booing.
Pretty much. This view, especially in its early form called emotivism, linked to philosophers like A.J. Ayer and C.L. Stevenson, suggested that moral language is basically expressive. Stealing is wrong translates roughly to stealing. Boo. Or maybe don't steal.
So it's not about describing the world, it's about expressing feelings or influencing behavior.
Exactly. If that's true, then reason can tell us what is the case, the facts of the world, but it can't tell us what ought to be. Our basic values aren't discovered through reason. They're seen as emotional attitudes, maybe instilled through upbringing, culture, conditioning.
And there's some psychological research that seems to back this up, right? The idea that emotions really drive our moral judgments.
Yes, some fascinating and frankly slightly disturbing studies. Research has shown that our moral judgments can be swayed quite easily by things that have nothing to do with reason or the facts of the case.
Like what?
Like exposure to bad smells. Studies found that putting people in a room with a faint, unpleasant odor made them significantly more likely to judge ambiguous actions, things like finding a lost wallet or minor deceptions, as morally wrong.
Seriously, a bad smell makes you more judgmental.
Apparently so. Other studies link feelings of disgust to harsher moral condemnation, even for things that are arguably harmless. If our moral compass can be so easily manipulated by irrelevant emotional triggers, like a smell,
It starts to look less like a tool for discovering objective truth and more like, yeah, a culturally conditioned emotional response, as you put it.
that's the non-cognitivist interpretation, certainly. It challenges the idea that morality is primarily a rational enterprise.
But hang on, didn't you say this emotivism thing, this radical non-cognitivism, ran into a huge logical problem almost immediately? Something that kind of undermined its own foundations?
Ah, yes. You're thinking the problem with logical positivism, the philosophical movement that originally championed emotivism. It's a classic case of a theory refuting itself.
Okay, refresh my memory. What was the core idea of logical positivism?
The logical positivists had this very strict rule called the verification principle. They asserted that a statement only has meaning if it can be verified empirically through observation or scientific testing, or if it's true by definition, like all bachelors are unmarried.
Okay, so scientific statements have meaning, logical statements have meaning. What about other kinds of statements?
According to them, anything else, statements about ethics, metaphysics, aesthetics, religion, was literally meaningless, just noise, nonsense, because you couldn't test it in a lab or prove it with logic alone.
So murder is wrong. would be meaningless.
Technically, yes, according to strict logical positivism. It expresses emotion, but it doesn't state a verifiable fact, so.
Meaningless.
Okay, wait a minute. What about the verification principle itself? The statement, only statements verifiable empirically or by definition have meaning. Can that statement be verified empirically?
No, it cannot. It's not a scientific finding. It's a philosophical claim about meaning and truth.
So, according to its own rule,
The verification principle itself is meaningless. It's a self-refuting statement. It saws off the branch it's sitting on.
wow, okay, so that's a pretty big problem.
It was a fatal problem for logical positivism as a movement. And because emotivism was so closely tied to it, it lost its main philosophical support. While non-cognitivist ideas are still around today in different forms, they can't rely on that original self-refuting positivist foundation anymore. They need a new justification. All right, let's put aside the emotional side and get back to the core metaethical relativism, the idea that moral truth is relative to a culture. Because even if it avoids that specific self-refutation problem of positivism, it seems to face some really crushing practical objections.
It really does, and the first one hits right at the heart of history and change,
Yeah.
the social reform problem.
Okay, what's the issue here?
If metaethical relativism is true, remember, a moral belief or action is only right or justified if it aligns with the prevailing moral code of its culture. That's the definition.
Right, the culture standard is the only standard.
Which means morality becomes inherently conformist. If your culture believes X, then believing X is morally right. If the culture changes its mind and starts believing Y, then Y becomes right. It's just a change. There's no basis for saying it's better or worse.
So you can't really talk about moral progress.
Exactly. To say we've made progress, like, say, moving from widespread acceptance of child labor to its condemnation, implies there's some external objective standard we're moving towards, a standard better than the old cultural norm. Relativism denies such a standard exists.
Let's apply that, like we did before, to a historical example. Think about the civil rights movement in the U.S.
Okay. In the 1950s and early 60s, the dominant culture in large parts of the U.S. was deeply segregationist. That was the prevailing moral code for many.
So, if relativism is true, what does that mean for someone like Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks?
It means that, according to the relativist framework, their views challenging segregation were, strictly speaking, morally false at the time, because they directly contradicted the authoritative code of their surrounding culture.
That seems completely backwards. They're seen as moral heroes precisely because they challenged an unjust system.
But the relativist framework has no room for that judgment. To call King a hero who moves society towards a better, more just state, you need a standard of justice that exists outside of what the majority culture believed back then. Relativism eliminates that external standard.
So it can't account for reformers, for moral progress. It basically rebrands heroes as just nonconformists or maybe even troublemakers who were wrong according to their own time standards.
That's the stark logical consequence. And for many people, that's just too high a price to pay. If a moral theory means you can't say that abolishing slavery or ending segregation was an objective improvement, they'll say the theory must be wrong, regardless of its logical neatness.
Yeah, that's a huge practical hurdle. What else?
Another major practical issue comes from the very concept that relativism relies on, the idea of a culture.
What's wrong with that?
Well, as our sources point out, the concept of a culture is actually incredibly vague and fuzzy, especially in the modern world. Trying to pin down the definitive moral code of a culture is almost impossible, which makes relativism difficult to even apply.
How so? Think about any complex society today, Britain, Canada, the US, wherever. Is there one single unified moral code?
Absolutely not. We have intense disagreements between political groups, between religious groups and secular groups, between different regions, between generations. The list goes on.
So if metaethical relativism says truth is relative to the culture's code, which culture's code are we talking about?
Exactly. Is it the national majority view? Is it your specific subculture? Your religious community? Your family? Your company's code of ethics?
If you define culture too broadly, like Western culture, the shared code becomes so thin and general it doesn't resolve any real disputes.
Right. And if you define it too narrowly, say down to the individual level, where my code is what's right for me, then you just end up with subjectivism or egoism.
Which basically says, whatever I feel like is right.
Yeah, and that's completely unworkable for organizing a society. Morality, almost by definition, has to be about shared standards that guide interaction between people. Individual relativism collapses into chaos. The vagueness of culture Makes the whole theory hard to pin down.
Okay, and now we get to what feels like the biggest gut punch objection, the one that makes people recoil.
The objection of moral abominations. This is often seen as the killer argument against relativism.
It's the idea that relativism seems forced to say that truly horrific things were acceptable.
Yes, if moral truth is only relative to a framework, and if a particular culture's framework genuinely endorsed, say, genocide or chattel slavery or ritual torture,
Yeah.
then the consistent relativist seems compelled to say that those actions were morally right or justified relative to that framework.
But that just feels intuitively deeply wrong. Surely some actions are just wrong, full stop, regardless of what any culture believes.
That's the powerful intuition driving the objection. The idea that we must be able to condemn something like the Holocaust as objectively, universally evil, not just wrong, according to our current Western values.
Can relativists respond to this? How do they try to get around it?
Some contemporary relativists try to soften the blow. They might say, look, we can still condemn the Nazis based on our moral framework, which values human rights and opposes genocide.
But that feels like dodging the issue, doesn't it?
It kind of does, because they still have to admit that from within the Nazi framework, those actions were considered justified. They lose the ability to say the Nazis were objectively mistaken about morality. They can only say, we don't share your values, not your values are fundamentally wrong.
It also seems like the objectivist has a much easier time explaining these historical horrors.
Right. The objectivist can say, slavery, the Holocaust, these were profound moral errors. Failures to grasp or adhere to objective moral truth may be driven by greed, ignorance, ideology, whatever. They can diagnose it as a mistake.
Whereas the relativist has to say, it wasn't a mistake relative to their own system, just different.
Essentially, yes, which many find morally unacceptable.
Okay, and finally, let's revisit that logical problem, the charge of self-refutation. We saw how it hit logical positivism, but does it hit metaethical relativism too?
There's a strong argument that it does, in a couple of ways. The classic logical charge goes like this. Consider the core relativist statement. All moral truth is relative.
Okay.
Is that statement itself supposed to be an absolute universal truth or just a relative truth?
The same kind of trap. If it's meant to be an absolute truth,
Then the statement contradicts itself because it asserts that no truths, including itself, are absolute. So not all truth can be relative.
and if it's only meant to be a relative truth, true only for relativists, perhaps.
Then why should anyone else accept it? If it's just true for them, it has no claim on us. It loses its philosophical force. The statement seems to undermine its own foundation.
That's the logical version. What about the pragmatic one you mentioned earlier? How does a relativist arguing for their view get into trouble?
This happens in actual debate. When a relativist tries to persuade you that relativism is a better, more accurate, more coherent, or more useful way to understand morality, what are they doing?
They're giving reasons, appealing to evidence, logic.
Exactly. They are implicitly appealing to shared, non-relative standards of justification. Standards like coherence is good, evidence matters, explanatory power is valuable.
But those standards, coherence, evidence, sound like objective values about how we should reason.
Precisely. The very act of engaging in rational argument to convince someone seems to presuppose that there are better and worse ways to reason, that there are objective standards for evaluating claims. The relativist, by arguing, seems to be using the very kind of objective standards their theory denies.
So if they were truly consistent, they shouldn't argue. They should just say, well, I prefer relativism, you prefer objectivism, end of story.
Pretty much. The act of trying to rationally persuade someone towards relativism is seen as pragmatically self-refuting. It relies on non-relative values to argue for the denial of non-relative values.
Okay, so we've seen some really strong arguments on both sides. Radical objectivity struggles to explain all that disagreement and cultural variation.
And radical relativism seems to face crippling problems with coherence, social reform, and condemning atrocities.
Which naturally leads philosophers to ask, is there a middle ground? Can we find positions that capture the insights of both sides?
Absolutely. This is where a lot of contemporary work in metaethics happens, searching for nuanced, mixed positions.
What does that look like?
One influential approach is moral pluralism. Thinkers like David Wong have developed versions of this.
Pluralism, meaning more than one right answer.
Kind of. Wong suggests that yes, there are probably universal constraints on what can count as a valid morality. These constraints likely come from basic facts about human nature, our needs for survival, social cooperation, raising children, things like that.
So there is an objective foundation based on human needs.
Yes. Certain things are just necessary for any human society to function. You need rules against arbitrary killing, some system for resource distribution, ways to ensure basic trust. These create objective limits.
But, and here's the pluralist part, I assume.
But Wong argues, these universal constraints are probably quite broad. They're like boundary conditions. Within those boundaries, there might be more than one genuinely good, rationally defensible, true morality.
Like different ways to build a functional house, different architectural styles, but they all have to provide shelter and stand up.
That's a decent analogy. Different true moralities might all share certain core values. Maybe they all care about fairness, rights, well-being, community, but they might prioritize them very differently.
So one true morality might put individual liberty absolutely first, while another true morality might prioritize community harmony or collective well-being above individual freedom in some cases.
Exactly. And both could be valid, functional moral systems that meet the basic human constraints. There isn't one single, uniquely correct way to rank or specify those shared values. That allows for genuine, deep moral diversity without falling into pure relativism.
That sounds quite similar to some ideas from Martha Nussbaum, too, doesn't it? Grounding things in shared human experiences.
Yes, there's a strong connection. Nussbaum argues for an objective framework based on universal features of the human condition, things we all experience regardless of culture. Mortality, fear, pleasure, pain, reason, affiliation with others, control over our environment.
These shared experiences give rise to shared spheres of choice where virtues are needed.
Right. Because we all face death and fear, the virtue of courage becomes relevant everywhere. Because we all deal with resources and other people, the virtue of justice is needed everywhere. Because we have appetites, temperance is needed.
So the basic concepts of these virtues, courage, justice, honesty, are objective and universal, rooted in our shared humanity.
According to Nussbaum, yes. But, and here's the flexibility, the specific way a community understands and practices that virtue, the specification of it, can legitimately vary depending on local traditions, beliefs, and circumstances.
So honesty might be a universal virtue, but what counts as acting honestly in a specific situation, say, when dealing with a difficult truth, might look quite different in Japan versus Germany versus Brazil.
Precisely. The core virtue is objective, but its concrete application is culturally shaped. It tries to blend universalism with sensitivity to difference.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about attempts to ground morality more directly in science, like biology or evolution?
That leads us towards forms of naturalistic realism. The idea here is to find objective moral facts within the natural world, observable through science. A prominent version of this is the moral as cooperation, MAC hypothesis.
Moral as cooperation, what's the core idea?
It views morality, especially our moral language and intuitions, as fundamentally an evolutionary adaptation, a toolkit that evolved to solve problems of cooperation.
Because cooperation is hugely beneficial for survival and reproduction, right? Groups that cooperate outcompete groups that don't.
Exactly. Humans are incredibly social and interdependent. Evolution would strongly favor psychological mechanisms that promote mutually beneficial cooperation, things like fairness, reciprocity, loyalty, respect for property, etc. Our moral sense is basically our evolved cooperation sense.
So if this is right, what does it mean for moral disagreement?
It might mean that a lot of what looks like fundamental moral disagreement is actually more like a negotiation or a dispute about the best strategy to achieve shared cooperative goals.
We all want cooperation, but we disagree on how to get there.
Potentially. Or we might disagree about the scope of cooperation, who counts as being in the cooperative group. The underlying goal, fostering mutually beneficial sociality, could still be seen as an objective good, grounded in evolutionary biology.
This sounds a bit like what Sam Harris argues too, right? Science determining human values.
Yes, Harris takes a related naturalistic approach. He argues that morality is about maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures. Since well-being depends on facts about brains, societies, and the world, science is, in principle, capable of telling us which actions and social structures promote well-being and which hinder it.
So good is what leads to objectively measurable human flourishing, and bad is what detracts from it. Morality becomes an empirical investigation, like medicine.
That's the idea. Find the peaks on the moral landscape of well-being. It attempts to bypass the philosophical debates by grounding morality directly in scientific facts about welfare.
Okay, one more nuanced view to consider, and this one tries to give relativism a more sophisticated foundation. You mentioned J. David Velleman's approach.
Yes, Velleman's work on local normativity and doables. This is quite subtle. It tries to explain how local practices or mores can become genuinely binding, like local moralities, without appealing to universal values, but by focusing on the very nature of social interaction itself.
Okay, that sounds abstract. Break it down. What's the core driver he identifies?
The core driver is our constant, fundamental need for mutual interpretability. To live together socially, we absolutely must be able to make sense of each other's actions, intentions, and emotions. If I have no idea what you're doing or why, cooperation is impossible. Social life collapses.
So we have this basic drive to understand and be understood by others.
Yes, and because of this drive, Vellman argues, communities naturally converge on shared ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that make interpretation easier. They develop common understandings, common emotional responses, common ways of doing things. He calls these shared practices the community's repertoire of doables.
Doables, meaning like the set of actions that are understandable and available within that social context.
Exactly. Think of it as the shared playbook for social interaction in that community. Certain actions become standard, expected, interpretable ways to achieve social goals. Other potential actions might become unthinkable or not done because they violate the shared interpreted framework.
Give me an example of how this creates real difference.
Velleman uses examples from anthropology, like a practice among the Malagasy people in Madagascar, where, in certain contexts, people intentionally give vague or uninformative answers to direct questions, like, where's so-and-so? They might say, he's either at home or in the market, even if they know exactly where he is.
Why on earth would they do that? Isn't that directly hindering interpretability?
From our perspective, yes.
Mm.
But within their social doables, giving precise, potentially challengeable information can risk losing face or creating social friction. The established, interpretable way to handle certain requests for information prioritizes politeness and avoiding commitment over factual accuracy. It's a different doable for managing social interactions.
Or that Javanese practice you mentioned, a tuck-a-tuck.
Right. Polite pretending or untruths that everyone understands are not meant to be taken literally and are immune from challenge. For the Javanese in those contexts, the action we call telling the literal truth might not even be a readily available doable in the same way it is for us. It's a socially constructed difference in the available ways to interact.
So Velleman's point is that these deep differences aren't necessarily about conflicting values, like truth versus politeness, but about fundamentally different social toolkits, different sets of doables that shape what actions are even conceivable or rational within that society.
Precisely. It suggests that comparing moralities across such different systems might be like comparing apples and oranges, because they're playing by different socially constructed rules of interaction, driven by the universal need for mutual interpretability.
Can we judge these different systems at all then?
Vellon suggests maybe not in terms of moral superiority, but perhaps in terms of functional superiority. We could potentially judge how well a society's set of doables actually facilitates smooth, reliable, robust mutual interpretation, the prerequisite for all social life. Some systems might just be better engineered for sociality than others in a non-moral sense.
Okay, let's bring this back to how these ideas play out in the real world, especially in politics and psychology. There's a very common claim you hear, especially in political debates.
Which one are you thinking of?
The idea that believing in objective morality, believing there's one right answer, inevitably leads to intolerance, to fanaticism, judgmentalism, trying to impose your views on others.
Yes, the objectivity breeds intolerance argument. It often gets framed as, the only real modern moral absolute should be, thou shalt not be intolerant.
Exactly. Relativism is presented as the necessary antidote, the path to open-mindedness and acceptance of difference.
It's a very common political use of relativistic ideas. But we need to be really careful here, as philosophers point out. We shouldn't automatically equate the metaethical question is moral truth objective with the psychological question, does believing in objective truth make someone dogmatic or intolerant?
Because the link isn't necessarily there?
Not necessarily. And in fact, the counterargument is quite powerful. Think about history again. Who are the people who most effectively fought against intolerance, against depression, against things like slavery or apartheid?
Often people with incredibly strong moral convictions.
Exactly. People like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, the suffragettes, they weren't arguing, well, equality is just our cultural preference. They were arguing that equality and justice were objectively right, universal truths that the existing system was violating.
So their belief in objective moral truth actually fueled their fight against intolerance and injustice.
Precisely. It gave them the conviction and the justification to challenge the status quo. So the idea that objectivity always leads to intolerance seems historically false. It can just as easily fuel movements for universal rights and tolerance.
This ties back directly to that tolerance paradox we mentioned earlier, doesn't it? The problem with normative relativism.
It does. Remember, normative relativism says because there are no absolute moral values, you ought to be tolerant.
But you ought to be tolerant, sounds like. An absolute moral value.
It is. Tolerance is a moral virtue, a value judgment. So the argument structure is, there are no absolute values, therefore here is an absolute value you should follow. Tolerance. It's logically inconsistent.
You can't derive an ought. Be tolerant.
Yeah.
Purely from an is. There's lots of disagreement or maybe no objective truth.
Exactly. If the metaethical relativist is truly right, and there are no objective moral values, then there's simply nothing anyone ought to do, including being tolerant. There's no moral basis for the command.
And psychologically, does relativism actually guarantee tolerance? You mentioned the non-cognitivist view earlier.
Right. If morality is just about expressing my feelings or attitudes, and my strong feeling is that X is right, and your strong feeling is that X is wrong, what happens?
I guess we just clash.
Maybe. The non-cognitivist picture suggests that if I have a strong attitude, my natural inclination might be to try and get you to share my attitude, to persuade you, maybe even manipulate or condition you to feel the way I do.
So far from ensuring tolerance, recognizing morality as just subjective feeling might actually lead to more attempts to impose one's feelings on others because there's no objective standard to appeal to, only competing attitudes.
That's a plausible psychological outcome, yes. The idea that relativism automatically breeds tolerance seems psychologically naive. Intolerance might just be a natural consequence of conflicting attitudes, regardless of one's metaethical beliefs.
Okay, one last area. What about just throwing up our hands and saying all talk about ought and should is meaningless? Just get rid of normative language altogether. Moral skepticism or eliminativism.
That's the most radical position. Trying to argue that we should just eliminate all normative concepts, moral, rational, aesthetic, from our thinking and language, perhaps like how science eliminated concepts like phlogiston or ether.
Can that even work? Can you argue against all oughts without using one?
That's precisely the problem, according to many philosophers. There seems to be a subtle but unavoidable self-refutation involved.
How so?
When the moral skeptic presents their argument saying we should reject normative claims because they're incoherent or ungrounded or whatever, what are they implicitly assuming?
They're assuming we should. Believe what's rational, follow the evidence, accept logical arguments.
Exactly. They are tacitly appealing to norms of rationality. They are arguing that it is rationally required, or at least rationally preferable, to abandon moral beliefs. They're making a claim about what we ought to believe based on standards of good reasoning.
So even in the very act of arguing against all normative facts, they have to presuppose some normative facts, namely facts about rationality itself, that we should be rational.
Correct. And facts about rationality, what constitutes a good reason, what you ought to believe, given the evidence, look an awful lot like objective universal normative facts. You can't seem to argue your way out of normativity entirely without relying on it.
So the whole debate about right and wrong, or at least about what we ought to think and do, seems inescapable. You can't just dismiss it all as meaningless.
It appears not. Some form of normativity, at least concerning rationality, seems foundational to thought itself. Hashtag under ethics statement.
So after this deep dive into metaethics, where do we stand? Well, the debate clearly persists because, frankly, both main sides face really significant challenges. Yeah, the moral objectivist, the one who believes in universal moral facts, still has that tough job of explaining why there's so much persistent, deep, seemingly irreconcilable moral disagreement across cultures and history.
Why doesn't moral convergence look more like scientific convergence? Why can't the philosophical experts even agree? They need a really good explanation for all that variation if the truth is supposedly singular and objective.
Right. But then the moral relativist, who says truth is just relative to culture, struggles mightily with the internal logic of their own position that self-refutation problem keeps popping up.
And perhaps even more damningly, they struggle with the real-world implications. How do you account for social reform? How do you justify condemning what seem like obvious moral atrocities if truth is purely relative? It seems to lead to morally unpalatable conclusions.
So the most promising directions, maybe, seem to be those nuanced positions we discussed, like pluralistic relativism or Velleman's focus on sociality.
I think so. Thinkers like Wong, Nussbaum, Vellman, they suggest the core disagreement might not always be about fundamental values. Maybe most functioning societies do implicitly value cooperation, welfare, mutual understanding.
The real difference lies in how they try to achieve those goals,
Yeah.
how they structure their social interactions, their doables, their ways of using language.
Exactly. The disagreement might be less about the ultimate destination, a functioning cooperative society, and more about the different paths, the different conceptual toolkits that cultures develop to get there, all constrained by that universal human drive for sociality and making sense of each other.
So we started asking if morality is like 5 plus 5 equals 10 or spinach tastes bad, and the answer seems to be, well, it's complicated.
It seems the underlying need for morality, for cooperation, for stable social life might be objective, almost like a mathematical necessity for creatures like us.
Like 5 plus 5 equals 10, it's a given.
But the specific moral codes that emerge, the detailed rules, the cultural practices, the Javanese toke talk, or the Malagasy assertions, they start to look a lot more like those local spinach preferences. They're deeply embedded, justified within their own system, but maybe not the only possible correct system.
There's an objective anchor in human needs, but a lot of relative variation in the execution.
That seems to be where much contemporary thought is heading. Which leaves us, and you, with a final, maybe provocative thought to chew on.
Go for it.
If it's true that our shared human nature pushes us towards valuing things like cooperation and welfare, and yet, despite these shared constraints, we still manage to create such vastly different, often conflicting moral codes and social realities. What does that persistent variation tell us about the real scope of human freedom? How much room do we truly have to construct our own ethical worlds?